and welcome to Driving Net Profit with Zero Emissions. I'm Barbara Albert, the co-CEO of 100% Renewables. Today's episode is a special one as we're revisiting a recent webinar that we hosted in collaboration with Tasman Environmental Markets, how to confidently buy high-integrity carbon offsets. Whether you caught the webinar live or you're just tuning in for the first time, get ready for a deep dive into the world of carbon offsets. Before we jump into that, a quick reminder to subscribe to Driving at Profit with Zero Emissions so you never miss an episode. And if you find this information valuable, consider leaving us a review. Now let's get started.
Hello, everyone. It's now 12:30, so let's get started with our webinar on how to confidently buy high-integrity offsets. It's a joint event of 100% Renewables and TEM. My name is Barbara Albert. I am the co-CEO of 100% Renewables, and it is my pleasure to welcome you today. Before we begin, we would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land from which we are all participating today. We pay our respects to the elders, past, present, and emerging. Today's webinar will cover a lot of ground. We will start with a brief introduction to offsets and the role in supporting decarbonisation efforts. We'll then explore how to identify high-integrity offsets, and TEM will provide us insights into their due diligence process and the way to select carbon projects. This will lead us into a discussion around greenwashing risks associated with carbon offsets and carbon neutrality claims. We will conclude with a practical guide to purchasing offsets, and TEM will share with us a case study from their partnership with Lion. We'll have about 10 minutes at the end to field questions from you guys. So let's just have a quick look into who's going to be speaking today. We are going to have Nicolas Francois speak. He is our manager, Net Zero Business Transformation. Additionally, we'll have Brett, Head of Digital Solutions at TEM speak, and Beck, Manager of Corporate Partnerships and Digital Solutions at TEM. Most of you will probably be familiar with 100% Renewables, but just a quick rundown about us for the ones who don't know us. We are a national consultancy specializing in the development of net zero, carbon neutral, and climate positive strategies. We work with large energy using businesses and government organizations with ambitious climate action goals. Carbon offsets are a recurring element in our work, whether it's for customers seeking climate active certification or as part of broader net zero strategies. From price volatility to scrutiny over their additionality and potential for greenwashing, the landscape for carbon offsets has been at the heart of many media stories over the last couple of years. It has brought many anxious questions from our client base. So we thought it was time to partner with TEM and share some of what we have learned and provide some advice on how to source high integrity offsets in an efficient and interactive way. I'm now going to hand over to Brett from TEM.
Thanks, Barbara. And a massive thanks from the team at TEM to 100% Renewables for managing all of today's activities. We really appreciate what you've done. Hi, everyone. I'm sneakily dialing in from Darawal country as I haven't made it to our Sydney office today. So full transparency on that. TEM is the largest provider of voluntary carbon offsets in the APAC region. But what we're really known for across all different types of sectors is our strong due diligence process and our core focus on integrity. We're the biggest funder of Indigenous carbon projects. We provide solutions for hundreds of different customers, and we manage the world's largest carbon offset program with Qantas. So the offset at checkout is a partnership that we've had in place with Qantas for many years. So TEM is a vertically integrated business. that sounds a bit strange for a carbon offset business, but explaining it quickly from left to right, we are a project developer. So we develop projects in Australia and Southeast Asia. We have a range of different customer-facing solutions depending on the size and complexity of your business. At the large end, we develop projects with customers. At the small end, we enable, fast and transparent purchasing through our TEM Online product. We have a full in-house tech stack, which TEM Online is part of, alongside some other products. And our wholesale desk, which is part of the engine room of the business, is able to source projects from scale all around the world.
Now, before we get further into our webinar, I wanted to share a few facts and figures on the carbon market. The chart here shows the growth of the market for carbon offsets. As you can see, it's a booming sector. And with the introduction of the Chinese compliance market, now almost 1/5 of global emissions are covered by a carbon market. Now, this is the current number of compliance carbon markets operating around the world, in which entities must purchase or trade allowances for the emissions they produce. As for voluntary carbon markets, so there's the compliance market where entities have to purchase, and there's the voluntary market where corporations or organizations purchase carbon credits voluntarily. No one is tracking the number of these markets worldwide. The same goes for the third-party non-profit organizations verifying the legitimacy of verified emissions reductions. Climate Active recognizes 5 of these voluntary carbon markets, but the Climate Change Authority review of international offsets recommends sunsetting 2 of them, and they also said that adding another 5 could be considered. Now, if that sounds confusing, it's because it is, and it can be quite daunting when you start considering purchasing offsets. In its 6th assessment report, which came out in 2022, the IPCC said that the deployment of carbon dioxide removal, CDR for short, to counterbalance hard-to-abate residual emissions is unavoidable if net zero greenhouse gas emissions are to be achieved. And while there is no universal consensus on the subject of carbon credits in decarbonisation, they are an important part of the solution to climate change, and they have their place in your toolkit to support emissions reduction. One last insight. In the recent State of Carbon Credits 2023 report, carbon data firm Silvera found that companies that purchase carbon credits decarbonize 2 times faster than those that don't. This goes against the recent argument against carbon offsets that organizations buy credits instead of reducing emissions. On the contrary, it seems that they do both. Before we go any further, we'd like to explain some of the basics around carbon offsets. I'm going to hand over to Nicola, one of our project managers and registered consultants under Climate Active, to explain the basics to us.
Well, thanks, Barbara. Some of these figures are enlightening. So let's just start with some very basic definitions. Carbon offsets are a financial tool that can be used to compensate for emissions that you cannot reduce and to bring your carbon footprint to neutrality. However, it is the last resort to get to a net zero position after you've exhausted all other measures. And carbon offsets are an acceptable way under both Climate Active here in Australia and Toitū in New Zealand to reach carbon neutrality. 1 carbon offset is issued for each ton of emissions that is either avoided or removed from the atmosphere. It then becomes a financial instrument that you can trade with other companies and individuals to meet your environmental goals. And this is done through carbon offset registries, which play a critical role in ensuring that a carbon offset is legitimate and that once its environmental benefits is claimed, that it is retired from the market. While that sounds straightforward, there's plenty of complexities. First of all, there is a lot of debate surrounding the ability of carbon offset to deliver tangible decarbonization. And most of it comes from the confusion that exists between the concepts of carbon neutrality and net zero pathways. So carbon neutrality is an interim target on the path to net zero. It's something that you can achieve straight away. You just need to purchase carbon offset in sufficient quantities to compensate for your carbon footprint. On the other hand, achieving net zero emissions is a much longer undertaking where you strive to fully abate your carbon emissions, and only when you have a minimal amount of residual emissions that you cannot be reduced, that you can balance it with carbon removal offsets. So these two concepts are different, but they're not exclusive. And let's just reinforce these concepts. If you want to achieve carbon neutrality, you put all of your emissions on one side of the scale, and then you buy offset to match your footprint. And this can be either carbon avoidance offsets or carbon removal offsets. Achieving net zero means that once you put all of your emissions on one side of the scale, you then work toward reducing this footprint as much as you can. And then you're left with just the unabatable emissions, for example, air travel that cannot be avoided by using different options, such as video conferencing or some types of industrial processing. At that stage, then you can compensate those residual emissions with offsets, which must be of the removal type. And eventually, you can also aim to be climate positive by buying more offsets than what your residual emissions are. Climate positive can also be called net negative, carbon negative, and we even heard the term carbon positive. So it's a little bit out there. Okay, so now that we know that net zero and carbon neutrality are not mutually exclusive, why would you do both? Well, we've left it very late to address climate change. And this slide is a bit sobering because we've got very little carbon budget remaining globally. Those figures are from 2020, but if we were to update them today, we'd be looking between 260 and 380 gigaton of CO2 emissions left in the carbon budget to stay under the 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming. And that's about 6.5 years of emissions at the current levels. So we really need to pull all the levers to have a chance of remaining within or close to the carbon budget. All feasible measures, including carbon offsets, are required to reduce emissions. And although setting and achieving science-based targets must be the priority, you should also invest in mitigations outside your value chain. So job number one is let's stop pollution before it even gets into the atmosphere. And then let's support nature's carbon cycle in the form of sinks. This is just an example to show how it works. Basically, you can see how in this graph, you can follow a science-aligned net zero pathway and at the same time achieve carbon neutrality. Say that you've set your pathway according to the requirement of the SBTi net zero standard, and you reduce your emissions through organizational, operational actions. Then when you get to about 90% reduction, in alignment with the ISO guidelines in net zero, you can then resort to offsetting a maximum of 10%. See if we can see my mouse there, 10% here using removal offsets only. But this approach does not preclude you to use offsets in a broader decarbonization strategy. And it simply emphasizes that offsets are a complementary measure and deep decarbonization of your operational and value chain emissions should be a continuing focus. But offset can be used to go even further and to achieve carbon neutrality straight away in your short to medium term or even climate positive. I hope that'll make sense. Now that we've got this background info, I think it's time to dive into the heart of this webinar. How do you identify this high integrity offset? And it doesn't make sense to go carbon neutral and purchase carbon offsets that might be dodgy. And the purpose of achieving carbon neutrality is that you want to prove to the marketplace that you care about the environment and that you are taking a stand against climate change. So you don't want to open yourself up to reputational damage. So you have to pay a lot of attention to the carbon offset projects that you are buying. We often run RFQs on behalf of our clients that, we're trying to ensure that not only do they get the right price for the offset, but also, and more importantly, to ensure that they're buying carbon credits that meet certain standards. I mean, the company's objective, you need to achieve that, and you want to make sure that you don't expose yourself to reputational risks. Okay, So the first thing to avoid that is that your carbon offset project must be credible. And this is the job of the accreditation standards like the Australian Carbon Credit Units, ACCUs here, because they set the criteria and they run the registries that ensure carbon offset projects are implemented. They run and manage properly, and eventually that the credit they represent are real and actual emissions that are sequestered or avoided. So look, what should a good offset be? Each of the standards have their own set of criteria to determine whether an offset is good enough, but in the end, they're very similar in intent. So we put together a quick list to help you understand what to look for. The first thing is additionality. So that's a complex concept initially, but basically it means that those emissions reductions or carbon removal, it cannot be claimed as offsets, at least if the greenhouse gas reduction or the conservation would have happened anyway. So for example, if you have a renewable energy project that would still have been economically viable without the extra revenue from the sale of offsets, or if you have an area of forest that is protected from deforestation, but when it was never in danger of clearing, it doesn't make sense to consider that as an offset. The next one is accurate quantification. So the offset must reflect an accurate estimate of the level of emissions reduction. There are many potential miscalculations that can lead to overestimation of offsets, such as overinflated baseline, underestimations of actual emissions, and failing to account for leakage, which is, for example, when you are shifting deforestation to other areas. So therefore, there is a requirement for robust and transparent monitoring and verification process. This is also why most certification bodies will only accept offsets for realized emissions reductions and not for future expected reductions, which is also known as forward crediting. The next one is permanence. So what you have to understand is that the CO2 emissions that we have emitted so far, they will stay in the atmosphere for thousands of years. So similarly, emissions reductions must be considered permanent, and they need to avoid the risk of reversal. So for example, if an area of forest was replanted as part of a carbon removal forestry project, and then it subsequently burns down, then all the carbon captured is released back into the atmosphere. Double counting. So offsets cannot be claimed by two entities for the same emissions reduction project. And that's why the certification bodies keep those secure public registries to keep track of offset claims and prevent the possibility of retired offsets being sold again. Last but not least, social and environmental harms avoidance. So offset projects should not have other detrimental effects. At the very least, they should meet the local applicable legal requirements and ensure that local stakeholders are consulted prior to implementation and have a way to express their grievance, if any. And many certification bodies actually go further than this, and they specifically require the projects to demonstrate additional social and environmental co-benefits, often in line with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So the first thing that is important to say is that, look, the carbon offset market is not perfect. It is a work in progress, just like most of the science around climate change. It's new, but it's getting better every day as new research happens and as we get a better understanding on how carbon is captured and sequestered and how new methods for both carbon removal and carbon avoidance are developed. So the real question is how to avoid the type of offset that are most at risk of reputational damage, and how to demonstrate that you have made the best decision based on today's knowledge. Now, I won't go into too much details, but here are some of the critiques you may have heard of. Quite a few. First, you would have heard back in 2022 of a series of publications that raised questions on the validity of ACCUs, and in particular from professors at ANU. And they said that up to 80% of the offsets did not represent real and additional abatement. And this has led to the Chubb review of the ACCUs under the Emissions Reduction Fund scheme. Similarly, you would have heard of criticism of international projects, and they also led to a review by the Climate Change Authority. Now, all these critiques, they're good news, actually, because they do push for improvement in the schemes. So, for example, the Chubb review, it does back up the ACCU scheme overall, but it did find that like its overall governance and transparency could be tightened. And it recommended specifically 3 changes to some offset methods, which are the avoided deforestation method, which we basically will be sunset on the 1st of April 2025. It also recommended that the human-induced regeneration method, also known as HIR, basically it's been validated, but it requires improvements, such as better demonstrating the link between the nominated changed land management practices and the resulting abatement that are expected to occur. And finally, they also recommended that the landfill gas methods should earn fewer ACUs over time. So it's all good stuff, because it just really helps for you guys to be certain that the offset that you buy are credible. In a similar way, the review of international projects has led to the recommendation that we should, for example, introduce a 5 years rolling vintage restriction to keep up with evolving practices and encourage continuous improvement. Now, last but not least, here on the right side, you have some projects. They seem to tick all the boxes from a carbon avoidance perspective, but they still can raise quite a few eyebrows in the general public. And that was the case for Westpac, because they got into trouble because some of the projects they supported were actually linked to a menthol factory. And that menthol factory was producing the menthol for tobacco manufacturing. And so you can clearly see, well, that is a credible offset, but it still could expose you to reputational damage. All right, so that's about the criticism. Now, let's touch briefly on all the other good things that can be derived from carbon offset projects. As I mentioned before, the quality of an offset project is not only about the credibility of the carbon avoidance or removal claim, it's also about a range of co-benefits that come with it. So there's economic benefits, which occur when income from the sale of offset credits flows to the community, or at least you would expect so, where a project, where the project is located, and it often translated employment and community support, improves infrastructure, technology transfer, increased economic activity overall. There's obviously the environmental benefits, and we think straight away of the increased biodiversity and maintaining habitat for native animals and plant species. But it is also improved local air and water quality. There's avoidance of vegetation clearance, reestablishing vegetation where it's been previously cleared, and overall improvement into environmental and agricultural management. There's also the social and cultural benefits. I mean, there are positive aspects for the communities where the project's based. We've already talked about employment, because, you know, employment for local people has a ripple effect associated with it. But we also talk about maintenance of traditional indigenous cultures, such as living and working on country. We can also talk about capacity building, improved health and education, access to clean and affordable energy. So eventually what you want to do is you want to pick those offsets that, yes, they're credible, but also maximize the co-benefits and choose them to support the projects that align with your corporate values. And this could be based on the type of sustainable development goals that are supported by the projects, but also their location, or also the synergy with your organization's reconciliation plan, for example. Okay, so that's a lot of things to consider, but thankfully offset projects need to go through a series of steps before you acquire them and retire your credits. So this creates a process where the responsibility of selecting high quality offset is not wholly onto you. It works a little bit like a funnel. So the first step is any wannabe offset project need to go through all the hoops of the offset standards and get certified by demonstrating they meet their requirements. Then they go through the screening of the different frameworks for which the offsets are going to be used. For example, here in Australia, only certain standards are accepted by Climate Active, but it could be other frameworks such as CORSIA or the Core Carbon Principles, and they have their own list of accepted standards. Eventually, you may source your offsets from an offset provider such as TEM, which will also complete their own due diligence process to select offset projects that are of the right quality. And at the end of the day, it does come to you to make your choice with potentially the help of an advisory service provider like us. So if we start with step one, it is the certification under one of the offset standards. This is a broad overview of everything that needs to happen before a project gets accredited. Now, I won't go into all the details again, but you can see it can be quite an onerous and rigorous process. And it will vary between different certification standards, but generally includes these following steps. First, the project developers must prepare the project design document, or PDD, that outlines in detail how the project will work and demonstrate how it will meet the credibility criteria that I've mentioned before, such as additionality, permanence, etc. Then it gets validated by an independent third-party auditor before undergoing local stakeholder consultation, during which the local community and other stakeholders can provide feedback and raise any concerns. If the project passes the validation process and the stakeholder consultation, then it will be registered with the selected certification standard and is officially recognized as a carbon offset project. Once the project is operational, though, the project developers must monitor the project's actual emissions reduction. And on a regular interval, maybe every 1 or 2 years, another independent auditor will verify that the project has achieved the emissions reductions claimed in its monitoring reports. And if the project passes the verification process, then the certification standard will issue the certified emissions reduction unit to the project. And both the validation and the verification process often include a public comment period for members of the public to review the auditor's report and raise any concern or dispute. So again, those are the general steps. Specific will vary. For example, some standards will also require the project to demonstrate all these additional co-benefits that I've mentioned before. The next step is for the offset standards to be accepted by the framework you want to use your offsets for. Like I said, here are, for example, the 5 standards that are accepted by Climate Active. So you can see straight away it narrows the field of possibilities. It narrows it so much that this review into the international offsets actually recommended accepting a handful of other standards. And now that's about the first 2 steps. And to talk about the due diligence process that is done by offset provider, I will hand over to Beck, who will be much more qualified than me. Over to you, Beck.
Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here today and to see a few familiar names on the call as well. So as Brett alluded to earlier, our mission at TEM is to support organisations in their decarbonisation journey by connecting them to high integrity carbon credits that have an impact on the environment and also on people. So due diligence and our process around that is really the backbone to this mission. And we carry it out for every project that we undertake and invest in to ensure that it has real and lasting impact. So we've got 3 pillars here that basically form our due diligence process. And we'll go into a bit of a high level into each of them. So the first one is governance, and this includes assessing the voluntary standard the project uses. It also looks at the project proponent and key stakeholders, their history, their experience, whether they've had a negative reputation, and just a little bit more, I guess, detail around them. And then we also look at how the project proponent established ownership of the project and whether First Nations communities were appropriately consulted and engaged in this process. Then we jump over to operational and we look at how the projects actually applied the methodology. And we also review the monitoring and verification reports. So, for example, within the verification reports, there'll be a lot of back and forth from auditors who might potentially pose questions to the project proponent. And we basically look at those responses to see how the project proponent has accurately, I guess, gone back to some of those queries. We also look at additionality, permanence, and leakage. And I've seen a couple of questions as well come through the chat around permanence, so I'll just address that in a little bit more detail. So with permanence, what we look at is whether the project has applied risk mitigation plans to the projects they put in place. So this might include fire and pest management practices, or perhaps even historical rainfall in the project area. Which would be most applicable to nature-based projects or HIR projects, which might pose a risk to reversal, for example, if it was in a low rainfall area. And I can dig into that in a bit more detail, maybe in the Q&A as well. We also look at whether there's been any delays to historical issuances in the project and why that might have been. And then finally, we look at socio-political factors. So this can include looking at the project co-benefits and SDG claims. Have they been verified and measured? We also look at social, human rights and political factors, including local stakeholder interaction. So as Nicola alluded to before, many of the core standards require you to do local stakeholder surveys or focus groups. And what we'll do is we'll look at any, I guess, issues that these local stakeholders might have raised, and has the project appropriately satisfied any of those concerns? And if so, why not? We also look at is the project at risk of any modern slavery concerns? For example, we won't usually purchase from projects from areas that have got historical risk of modern slavery, such as the Wei region in China. And then we also do a media and press scan as well. So this is just a few of the questions that form approximately 100 data fields that might be collected as part of our project risk assessment and conclude whether a project is of low, medium or high risk, and thus determines whether we, I guess, procure the project. On top of this as well, in exciting news, we've also partnered with Silvera, which you might know as the global leading rating agency, and we're the first Australian carbon service provider to do that. So that will also provide an additional layer to our due diligence process. So a bit of our due diligence in action. So to provide a top-line example of how we manage our risk when procuring projects, the below shows 2 examples of human-induced regeneration projects. For those who don't know, human-induced regeneration projects, they generate carbon credits from regenerating native forest on land that has previously been cleared. So on the left is an example of a project that we would deem too risky. The average rainfall is 280 millimetres, which is below what we would typically accept. So we only develop projects over 350 millimetres. And that is just because of risk factors surrounding drought, as well as, is that the rainfall obviously needs to adequately support forest regeneration. Then we look at additionality. So as Nicola alluded to before, on the back of the Chubb review, there was a couple of improvements that were said to be made, including the public disclosure of carbon estimation areas, which is really the area which indicate the area where carbon credits are issued and the project activity occurs. So in this example here, it might be a bit difficult to see, but where there's those vertical lines, so pretty much anything to the right of that pink line is this project's carbon estimation area. And we had a few concerns with this. The first being that you can see within the area it includes large bodies of water, so just where Nicola's placing his cursor there, as well as bare areas where there would be questionable forest potential and roads. So you can see a few roads in there. So this project is basically insinuating that issuance of credits would come from those areas when we know that that's not going to be the case. Then if we jump to an example on the right, which is one of a project that we've managed, you can see a bit of a stark difference here. I'm not too sure if you can click again, Nicola? Yeah. Perfect. Awesome. Go. So you can see that this area has been really defined and distinguished. So those vertical lines are only in really small areas of this project map. The roads have been excluded, as have any large bodies of water, and even areas where there is mature forest growth that would have been there prior to the project's implementation. So you can see that on the right. So that's just a bit of an example of, when we're looking at the projects, how we identify how we apply our due diligence project to the carbon estimation areas, as well as looking at permanence factors such as rainfall.
Great. Well, thank you, Beck. As you can see, behind the same claim can exist different realities, and that's where it gets difficult. And that brings us to the hot part of our webinar, the topic of greenwashing risks. So we've heard from many of our customers about their concerns around the potential reputational risk associated with the use of carbon offsets in general, and the use of the term carbon neutral in their environmental claims in particular. So to address this topic, I will now turn to Barbara, Brett, and Beck and seek their perspective on a few points. I'll stop sharing so you can see them all. Let's start with the term carbon neutral. So what is your opinion on that term? How can it potentially raise concerns of greenwashing? Barbara, do you want to provide your view and then we can move on to Brett?
Yeah, thanks, Nicola. So I think carbon neutrality is a very binary concept. You either are carbon neutral or you're not. There's no wiggle room. And this binary approach can be risky when it comes to greenwashing. So say, for instance, in your carbon footprint boundary for your carbon neutral claim, you have not included category 2 from scope 3 being capital goods. And your inventory gets published. People can see that capital goods are not included. Now, while it's okay, it may be okay from your perspective to exclude capital goods for reasons such as them being immaterial, others may not see it in the same way. But switching perspective by looking at the impact you're causing by investing in projects beyond your value chain, instead of thinking in terms of whether every single ton of carbon emissions has been balanced by the purchase of offsets, may be of help to you. But this will mean that you can invest in carbon projects demonstrating that you care about the climate without necessarily claiming carbon neutrality. But having said all that, I do think that the term carbon neutral as a claim has its place, so long as you don't lose focus on deep decarbonisation. And this sentiment is also reflected in the new ISO 14068 Part 1 standard, which is going to be released very soon.
Thanks. What's your view, Brett?
So, relatively similar to Barbara, I think that no matter what the environmental or social claim is that you're making, it's all about consistency, clarity, and transparency. So you've got to have credible data to point back to. I personally believe that, what we need to focus on is what sits behind all these claims, not the hashtag carbon neutral claim that we use at the end. So there's two big things that I think need to be addressed. The first one is scope. So as Barbara pointed to, two different organisations might be claiming carbon neutrality, but the scope of their footprint and what they're ultimately offsetting might be different. I don't necessarily see a direct issue with that. It's more about the clarity behind what the claim relates to. So being clear and transparent about that. And so an example is, some organisations making carbon neutral claims on and including all scopes, but in converse to that, using a different term, if we're talking about net zero, which you pointed out is quite different to carbon neutrality, but not exclusive. Some people are making net zero claims that only cover scope 1 and 2. So we need to create a clearer framework. The other big challenge is transparency. So the best way to address greenwashing is to be transparent. So be factual, transparent. Bringing that back to offsets, it's really why you need to make sure that where you're buying your offsets from, the person you're buying your offsets from is able to give you all of the information that you actually need to talk about what you're doing. So, you shouldn't necessarily see offsets as a way to compensate only. You really want to be communicating about the impact that you're having.
Nice. Well, thanks, Brett. Now, staying with this topic of the term carbon neutrality, we know that Climate Active is currently seeking feedback on a range of changes to the scheme, and that includes potentially changing the way members can claim carbon neutrality. Brett, you want to tell us a little bit more about this?
Yeah, definitely. So I should footnote this with TEM are huge fans of Climate Active. Like, it's really important from our perspective that there is a government-led national nationally recognised body that's supporting this sector. I definitely encourage everyone on this call, if they're a climate active member, to submit feedback through that review that's currently that you've just mentioned. So part of the review, as you pointed out, does relate specifically to claims about the certification. And there's a big opportunity for government, again, to provide clarity around what this claim is. So, if there's a clearly defined definition, then we're all able to point back to that, and we're able to have that consistency I talked about earlier. One thing I was thinking about after our last chat, Nicola, is whether or not there's a way to move towards something more consistent, like the recyclability labelling for packaging. So, that's managed by Planet Arc in the packaging sector with government oversight. And there's essentially, a whole framework that sits behind what gets put on a label. That could really help.
Nice. Yeah, that would definitely. But let's suppose that an organization, decide, nonetheless say, well, I get all of this, but there's still some of my customer that may look at it, even with funny eye, and they decide not to use the term carbon neutral. What could be other types of claim they could make? There's an idea that it would be more accurate to talk about a contribution concept, and that's an idea that's floating around. So should the purchase of offset lead to a claim of, say, supporting global decarbonization effort? Would that be less risky? Barbara, what do you think?
Yeah, I guess there are potentially other terms that could be used, but to me, like Brett said, the most important thing is climate action, global decarbonization. It's important that corporates pursue targets such as carbon neutral and net zero, and that they do that with integrity. So to me, integrity in what you claim is much more important than the term that's being used to describe what you do. I can highly recommend the UN high-level expert group's Integrity Matters report with its 10 recommendations. So to give you a few examples of those recommendations, says emissions reduction should cover all scopes, which Brett mentioned earlier. You have to prioritize urgent and deep reductions of emissions across your value chain. External offsets should not substitute for or delay reducing emissions directly, and at a minimum for offsets to meet the additionality and permanence criteria. I guess the other point I'd like to make is that in the past 2 years, finally, we got clarity around the terms net zero and carbon neutral. Previously, it was all a mess, but now with the release of a number of SBTi and ISO guidelines and standards, we've now clarity of what the difference between those terms is. So if we just stick to the definition that is used in the upcoming ISO 14068 Part 1, which is on carbon neutrality, it's the balance of your emissions with the same number of carbon credits, but you absolutely have to prioritize emissions reduction. And like ISO 14068 states, you have to be transparent around your carbon offset purchase, exactly what Brett said earlier. It's integrity, transparency, just be really clear in how you communicate what you're working on and what you've achieved.
Right, great. Well, thanks, Barbara. So I guess I think it's fair to say then that carbon offsets are not a perfect solution, and it would be almost impossible to point to a specific carbon project or a specific carbon offset standard and hand on heart say there is no risk associated with it. But as we mentioned before, we still need to pull all the levers, and carbon offsets are an important one. So basically, we can hardly afford to stay on standby, just because a perfect solution does not exist, and we're afraid of reputational risk. So maybe it comes down to the way organizations communicate on their claims and the type of offset they purchase. So, Beck, turning to you, would you be able to tell us more on how TEM support client organization in their communications? I mean, eventually, should the fear of greenwashing lead to greenhushing? And maybe you can start explaining to the audience what is greenhushing to start with. I'm going to share again I think you've got a slide you want to show us.
Yeah, sounds good. And just also doing a bit of a time check, I'll probably run quite quickly through this one. So as Nicola alluded to before, obviously there is increasing scrutiny by the ACCC, but also consumers on companies who, are potentially greenwashing. So what we're now seeing is this phenomenon of greenhushing, whereby organisations stay quiet around their impact for fear of being labelled as greenwashing or falling short of their targets. We know that organisations discussing their climate actions can have a positive knock-on effect and can support climate change, but they can't if they stay silent. So there's a couple of ways that they can support sharing their claims, and this is the 8 principles from the ACCC guidelines. And the overarching theme here is transparency. So we've worked with a number of organisations with their communications, including a recent client who was looking to revamp their consumer-facing opt-in program. And as part of this, we overlaid these 8 principles, and that included things like transparently sharing how their consumers' emissions were calculated, educating consumers on what carbon offsetting actually entails, displaying the program's results, selecting images that represent the projects chosen and ensuring appropriate approvals are being taken place, including additional and verified information on the projects, and linking back to the organisation's broader sustainability strategy, just to name a few.
Right. So yeah, it's a bit of a time check. I think we are running a little bit late, so let's try to press forward. I'll leave it with you, Beck, just to give us some perspective in the practicalities of purchasing offsets, and how do you help balancing flexibility and financial security in the acquisition of offsets?
Awesome. So managing forward market risks, it's fast becoming a sharper focus with global demand expected to outstrip supply. And you can see on the right here, this is a diagram formed by McKinsey that basically shows by 2030, demand is expected to increase by a factor of 20, and then by 2050, it's expected to increase by a factor of 100. And this is driven home by a similar research piece that was done by Allied Offsets. I think it was released last week, that basically stated if organisations currently active in the voluntary offset market offset just 1% of their emissions, it will basically, quadruple the demand for offsets in the near future. So how can organisations, I guess, best secure their credits? And if we jump to the next slide, I'll show you a few ways that we support organisations. So on the left here, this is the simplest form, a spot purchase that we usually support organisations with. And this is basically the immediate purchase of high quality carbon offsets at the best available price. Then we have forward contracts. So this is where we align with an organisation on a price, a volume of offsets to be delivered within a certain period. So a lot of our clients choose a forward contract for 3 years. And that allows them to have a sense of security over price and supply of offsets. We also have existing project acquisitions. So we occasionally have projects that we offer out to market for clients to be able to acquire. We also support new project investments. So we have a number of projects both here in Australia and internationally that we are looking to create, and we're therefore looking for partners to support with investment. And then we also have joint venture projects whereby we partner with organisations who might have specific parameters or criteria and develop projects with them.
Cool.
Sorry.
I don't know if you have more. I was just looking at the time. I thought maybe we can move on to the next one, because it's important. That's a case study on Lion. So definitely would like the audience to hear about that. So can you tell us a little bit more about it?
Yeah, sure. So Lion is Australia's first large-scale zero-carbon brewer, and they've actually adopted science-based target commitments to reduce carbon emissions by 55% by 2030 and net zero by 2050 versus 2019 baseline. So in addition to this, TEM have supported Lion in achieving carbon neutrality across its organisation, as well as a lot of product certifications as well, including the first carbon neutral beer for X0. So we worked with Lion to choose offset projects that really aligned with their strategy. So this included purchasing bush regeneration units from projects in southwest Queensland for their 4X0 product, which is a Queensland founded product. So that was a really nice synergy there, as well as connecting them to our partnership with the Arnhem Land Fire Abatement, which is an Indigenous program that supports savanna burning carbon credits. And that also helped support Lion's broader RAP as well, or Reconciliation Action Plan. The interesting thing about Lion is carbon offsets haven't resulted in Lion taking their eyes off eliminating emissions. In fact, it's actually helped them establish an internal carbon price, which has been this, I guess, step factor in supporting reduction activities, such as they've recently achieved 100% renewable electricity through power purchase agreements across their entire Australian operations, which is really awesome. And we're seeing this become more common, this theme of an internal carbon price supporting organisations with actually driving their decarbonisation faster. And it comes back to that point of organisations who purchase offsets decarbonise twice as fast as those who don't.
Great. Well, that's a great case study. And Barbara has also interviewed Lion in one of her podcasts and says the link here that you can follow to access it. Now, look, I'll hand over to you, Barbara, for the Q&A section. I think we probably don't have 10 minutes, but we could have like 6 or 7 minutes, 8 minutes to go through the Q&A. Over to you, Barbara.
Oh, thank you. Well, it's really interesting to hear about all that you had to say. Very, very interesting. So lots of questions. Some are easy and quick. Some are much more deeper. So let's do a quick rapid fire for the ones that we can deal with very quickly. Tim, do you have any First Nations Aboriginal carbon offsets program that you can recommend?
Sure do. I've responded in the chat because I wasn't sure we were going to get to that one.
Oh, good, good.
Yeah, we're the largest
Why
provider
can't I see that?
Indigenous offsets in Australia, and the Arnhem Land Fire Abatement project that we support is, in our opinion, the best project, hands down, in Australia across all projects.
Fantastic, thank you. What about COSIA? Do the COSIA eligible offsets align with the climate active acceptable offsets?
For those that don't know, COSIA is the standard that's being adopted by the aviation industry, and the answer is no one knows yet. So what's eligible is still being defined. So I guess watch this space.
Another quick question on the vintage. Do you guys have an opinion on the vintage of offsets? So newer offset vintages, are they better than older ones?
I'll answer this one and then Beck can take over because I've already put a response in here, but this is a relatively contentious issue. It's hard to say either way for all projects. But if you look at it from like a general perspective, a project issues credits over an extended period. And if the project's in a developing region and the community that relies on that project is reliant on funding from that project, then it doesn't matter when the credits are issued. They're all equally important at providing funding to that community. In the case of some forest-based projects, you could actually argue that older vintages are the vintages that kind of kick-started those projects and really got the community to start caring about protecting that project. So you could argue they have more value.
What about forest fires? Are they considered part of the carbon cycle for that land use and therefore still part of the permanent growth and regrowth sequestration cycle?
Yeah, so I can jump in on this one. So I think I mentioned before, and I saw a couple of questions around permanence. So, for example, with human-induced regeneration projects and also a lot of land-based projects, they do require a level of fire management practice to be put into place. And this can be things, such as establishing fire breaks, having relationships with your local CFA, monitoring, burning loads, etc. So there's definitely things that clients or projects can put in place to manage that fire risk. Also, not to get too technical, but, with the human-induced regeneration projects or sequestration projects under the Australian standard, they are also required to pool a certain amount of buffer units into a buffer pool. So if a fire does come through and affect part of the project, those projects can rely on this buffer pool to help support them in times of need.
Can I basically, Barbara, jump in there, and maybe that'll answer another of the question is, I think it's important to understand that this reforestation project, they're part of the carbon removal type of offsets and project. And if we make the distinction between carbon avoidance and carbon removal, carbon avoidance is everything that helps boost the transition to low carbon practices. So renewable energy, capture of methane from landfill and stuff like that. They're very accurate and they're obviously permanent because you didn't produce these emissions. But we need to move into carbon removal. And so that's important. And that's what you were pointing in the IPCC reports. We will need carbon removal to suck in all the emissions that we put out. And the thing is, like right now, by far, the vast, like 99.9% of the carbon removal relies on nature-based. And it is true, there's always this question, well, is it permanent or yes or no? And yes, there's big question mark about how long is this permanent? How long can you ensure that this will stay there if there's going to be burn or something? But right now, that's all we have. So we need to invest in this carbon removal nature-based project, even though there is some level of risk associated with it, to suck up all this carbon while we're also developing this other technology-based type of removals, such like as direct air capture, where you suck up basically the air, remove the carbon and put it underground. And I know this is very contentious, but we will eventually have to move towards that. And in the meantime, nature-based carbon removal is the only thing that we can do to basically remove carbon. So that probably helps about this idea, like we need to progress, from avoidance to removal and to permanent removal through technology, I would say, in addition, obviously, to reducing emission and not putting it out in the atmosphere in the first place.
Yeah. Great. The final question I'd like to pose before we wrap up is the question on insetting. So we've got a couple of questions on that. So insetting as opposed to offsetting, where you use your own land to sequester carbon, for instance. Any views on that, Tim?
Yeah. So look, I can only comment from an offsetting perspective. But I saw that there's a couple of landowner questions and a local government posing as to whether they could inset within their own boundary. It really comes down to scale. At the end of the day, there aren't small carbon offset projects out there because they require scale to be financially viable. And then, as Beck alluded to, where your project is defines its success at the end of the day. So a lot of the places where we live or have farms aren't the ideal carbon the places for carbon offset projects. That said, I think there's a huge opportunity, and there's definitely a lot of people looking into ways to inset within agricultural systems. So it's definitely worth exploring.
I have to stop the questions here because we're nearing the end of our webinar. Let's just quickly wrap up with a few key takeaway messages. There is a reason for quality. It's not just about what type of project it is. There's a whole range of factors you need to consider when purchasing carbon offsets. Not every carbon credit is the same. Remember that carbon credits are just a part of the decarbonisation toolkit. They're definitely not an alternative to net zero commitments and action. They supercharge your net zero commitments. Greenwashing is a reasonable concern. You should focus on transparency and demonstrated quality. And you can't afford to sit on the sidelines. We all need to act now. We hope that this webinar has given you confidence to purchase carbon credits with high integrity.
And that wraps up another episode of Driving Net Profit with Zero Emissions. A big thank you to our guest speakers from the webinar, Brett Giddings and Rebecca Hurd from TEM, and to all of you for joining us. If you have any questions or if there's a topic you'd like us to explore in a future episode, reach out to us on social media. We love hearing from our listeners. Until next time.